and knock out some of the necessities of my duties as chair and welcome everyone and call this meeting officially to order. And again, read our infamous statement that we are so proudly hold ourselves to. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged on focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. At this time, I will take roll call. Russ.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here.
Emily. David.
Good morning.
Chrissy.
Here.
Commissioner McCord. Claude.
Good morning.
Logan.
Good morning.
Good morning. Lauren. Senator Hensley. Representative Darby. And Gordon. Okay. There's Lauren signing in. So at this time, was there any comments or questions there? As you know, at our last meeting, we actually submitted our feedback and follow-ups that were reported by Penny. Penny, do you want to have any comments to start out for our submission from our last meeting?
No, I don't believe there were any follow-ups that you all were waiting on from me. And we're going to share though the document that you all commented on. That's what we will use today to prioritize your recommendations.
Okay, so I'm going to ask that you go ahead and pull that document up. For those that were not able to log into our teams and work on this document, I did enter any comments or feedback into the existing document. I am going to recommend that today we focus primarily on performance funding, the performance funding piece and prioritization. And if everyone also received an email from David that SCORE has done a tremendous job working on this. So I am going to ask if anyone is, doesn't mind that David take a lead on this as we look at our base and weights and direct funding. Of course, everyone has an opportunity to have their own input, but I just thought that would be an excellent way to prioritize and finalize our feedback and reflections. Does that sound like a plan for everyone? Sound good? Thumbs up. Okay. So we will start with the base. And David, the floor is yours.
Lonnie, can I ask one quick question, Penny? Sorry. on the PowerPoint, it said that part of what we would do today is be reviewing public comment on the draft framework. And I don't think I've seen, do we have any public comment on the draft framework that was released last week? And I'm just curious if there's any public comment we should be looking at related to the framework released last week, given that that feels pretty important around kind of what the potential proposal would be.
There are lots of documents in your week 5 Google folder. I believe that should be one of those. That should be one of those documents.
I didn't see it either. I'm glad David brought that up. I looked this morning and I clicked in all of them and I didn't see it.
Okay, then what we'll do this way, if you don't mind, I will get that information and put it in your Google folder. I'll let you all know prior to next week, and we can go ahead and prioritize according to what you all think, and then next week we can go back and take a look at that, the policies next week, and then we'll also take a look at the public comment. And I apologize that it didn't make it in there.
No problem. I just know that the big framework that was released last week is new. You know, that's new information, and it I think feels right for I think this group to be reflecting.
Yes,
on.
Well, and that's one of the things, the public comment. And I apologize that it didn't make it in your folder, but that's what we'll do. We still have a pretty packed agenda today, and then next week, as we're discussing those policies, or prior to discussing the policies, we can go back and take a look at the public comment and then your recommendations one final time, which is what you would want to do anyway.
And I would share that I do have I printed out the public comment that I saw. So are y'all, help me understand what public comments y'all are referencing, so I'll be on the same page.
Well, I think we're talking about the public comment to the framework that was proposed.
Okay.
So it would be feedback that happened within the last few days. And yeah, I looked at the file this morning too, and it's loaded up with a lot of Department of Ed documents, but no public comments.
Okay. Thanks. Because I'm looking at my dates and they're like January the 11th and so forth. Okay. Thank you. So are we ready to look at our existing document? David, you want to take that, please?
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to have David just kind of guide us. I know there's some duplication because in this form that we probably want to delete, but the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Ilana. So, I mean, I think on the base, I mean, at least the way we're thinking about this is, you know, the base is everything that you would want to have to essentially cover the kind of core costs and sort of, you know, the core sort of components of the kind of K-12 learning experience. I think one of the things that's a little bit challenging here, and I know we listed some examples here, but I know the sort of thinking is that we would be moving to a student-weighted formula as opposed to a resource-based formula. And we got a lot of resources here. And so I think maybe just one thing that I might raise is maybe making sure that from this committee's perspective that we at least have some of the most important things that we would want to have included in that core kind of base funding. And I think we've got a lot of these here. I mean, I think a lot of the things that we've all heard, and I know some of the other feedback that we got over the last 2 weeks included some additional things around counselors and you know, some of the things that we've talked about already. But you know, at the end of the day, I think from our perspective, you just want the base to be more per student than we're getting right now, and then you'd have these other components added on to that core base. So there may not be a ton to talk about on the base, given that some of these other categories like weights and performance funding probably feel a little bit more related to what we would be discussing as a subcommittee. But to me, at least, it feels like a lot of what we have right here feels right track in terms of things that we would want to make sure that every student essentially is getting support for. But would love other thoughts or other thinking that folks have.
Any other comments there or suggestions? Are we all in agreement?
I guess I want to clarify the comment that I put in there about, the specifying a 1 to 100 ratio for counselors. I know that our role as a subcommittee is almost to kind of shoot the moon, right? We're looking at best case scenario, but in terms of if we want to be almost like we want our recommendations, we want them to pay attention to them. We don't want them to be so out there that they kind of aren't taken seriously. And I think just fiscally, the cost of moving from what we have now, which on average is, it's 1 to 350, 325 for high school, but it's 1 to 500 for elementary and middle. So to bring us even to the 1 to 250, you're looking at an incredible increase in investment. And David, to your point, like no one has talked about increasing spending. And so I guess my question, I'm fine to keep it in there. I would love, absolutely, all of my organization would love 1 to 100. But since we do have research that gives evidence in other states, Colorado being one of them, that the 1 to 250 ratio provides incredible supports and gains in academic achievement, post-secondary success. I wonder if we want to, for now, temper our recommendation and kind of get it to the national average or the national recommendation. But I'm completely open. I just want us to be clear, like this is a huge increase in spending for salaries.
Lauren, I think that makes sense. I mean, you've got a really good sense of what makes the most sense here. I would certainly be comfortable with splitting those two. And again, I think like from my perspective on the base piece, I think I feel less strongly about what are the list of resources that we have in the base and more that the base amount is just more than the per pupil amount that students are currently getting today. And so I think, if there ever was a conversation coming back to this, making sure that at least we're saying that we want to get to the national average on counselors, I think is smart. So I'm fine with that.
I agree as well. And to your point, I know some of the feedback that I read, they were concerned that focus would be put on what they considered admin positions and not teacher and instructor positions, where they felt needed to be, more, there should be more focus there. So I like that recommendation.
It leads me though to believe, or maybe just to ask the question of the group, are we going for like a BHAG, right? Or are we going with like, let's put out like reality-based recommendations? Because I always I think the 1 to 100 was my idea, and I always sort of shoot for the BHAG, right? And understand, I'd hate for us, this would be my only just playing devil's advocate, us to say 1 to 250 and they meet us in the middle and say like, oh, they recommended 1 to 250. And so we're going to meet, we're going to negotiate and think like, oh, 300 might be better. So I guess that's a question for the committee. Do we want to put out the BHAG or do we want to be reality based in what we put out there? Because I do think that's a different mindset in how it applies to everything else.
Yeah, Chrissy, I think that we used that number last time because we thought it was our aspirational goal. That's what we want. Maybe we could modify the language to say no less than the national average with an ideal toward 100. Or,
I like that.
How about that?
I like that. I like that too. And the other thing on this
good
point that we might want to even say, and this is something that y'all may have seen the feedback that we shared on the draft framework, it's a little unclear to me whether we're actually building an exhaustive list of all the things that we would want in a base, or whether we're highlighting some examples of things that we would definitely want to see. So we could even mention that too, right? So, to Claude's point, just being a little bit more careful about saying these are the kind of things at a minimum that we would want to see, acknowledging that there may be other things or higher levels that may be important as well.
Penny, are you the one sharing your screen here?
Yes, I am.
Could you, I'm sorry, I'm getting old. Could you increase the size of that?
I will do that. Is
Oh,
that any better?
oh, so much.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
All right, should we go to?
So I want to ask.
Sorry.
When we think, so when we think about supports and services, so counselors are the only place where we think we can move the needle, where we want to make a recommendation. I mean, is someone going to be talking about tutors or academic support for students in high school, grade school?
Yeah, Logan, that's a great question. And I think that's what what's a little challenging about the framework here. I mean, in the framework that the department released last week, tutoring, as an example, was included in a direct funding category. It wasn't included in the base. It was included in a proposed direct funding, which I think makes sense, right? You're saying very clearly we want to fund this as a specific area of focus. So I think it's a really good point. I think the question is just, are we talking about that related to base or another category? And I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, because I want to keep pushing that. I would like to have a lot more prepared students for higher education, and the majority of our students are not prepared.
Do you think it would hurt if we just added it here? I don't think it would hurt anything. I think we can add it. So let's add it.
All right. Would somebody mind sharing that with me?
Logan, can you share with her again what you want added?
Well, this is not my area of expertise, and I sit on the receiving end of this, but I want students to have more time on academic issues, on working on building their basic skill sets in reading, writing, and mathematical reason. I want them to spend more time with that and working on those skills, because they have the minds and the brains to do it. They just have not spent the time on it to develop those skill set and their knowledge base. And I don't know, tutors will help, or it just needs to, for me, it just needs to be a priority among all the things that we suggest. That's got to be an everyday priority.
You know, and Chrissy, that kind of plays into what you were saying last time we met, in terms of making sure that that remediation is addressed before graduation rather than after graduation. And so that kind of goes to, Logan, what you're saying there is that make sure they have those fundamental skills in place and that we pay attention to them at that point.
One of the things that this is making me wonder is, just because this is our kind of formal recommendations, I think we ought to say up top that this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. I think we ought to say that this is meant to be some examples that we think are important, but we're not saying that this is the only thing that we want to make sure is supported in a base.
Okay, so I do think, as challenges addressed prior to post-secondary, social workers should be included in the base. Students at all levels have access to high quality materials and curriculum. High-risk counties should have a reduced ratio of counselors to students. Do we need that as well as that first sentence there, where we 1 to 100, do we need that stated again, or can we combine those, or what are your thoughts there? Or should it just remain separate?
I like teasing it out. I mean, I think it's the right call to say, you know, and I know that comes later in weights too, but I think we need to acknowledge that there are just some counties where the college going rate is abysmal, and additional support should be, you know, we should pour gasoline on those things in those counties, I think.
Fantastic. Okay. Adequate training for school counselors to ensure that every high school has a highly qualified career counselor, middle school counselor, career exploration opportunities for all students. The base should reflect an overall increase in recurring funding in the formula. The base should be high enough to result in an overall increase for all districts and students with greater needs. Any recurring per pupil education funding through the formula should put Tennessee at or above the national average for financially supporting education. That's what we have for must-haves. Should have provide additional exposure and opportunities for EPSO and CTE. The base should be pegged to inflation. Technology support all students to increase learning capacity. Nice to have, high school students should have the opportunity for work-based experiences and to have this count as part of their curriculum. And long shot, remove limits on number of opportunities for EPSO and CTE exposure, students being able to get TCAT diplomas while still in high school. Anything else for base, David?
No, ma'am.
Or anything else? Are we ready for weights? Everyone? Okay, let's move to weights.
Maybe the one thing I just would note here is just to kind of situate us on what was released last week. In the proposed list of weights that the department released as part of the framework, the proposed weights were poverty and concentrated poverty, rural unique learning needs, which included, you know, lots of different sort of specific student supports, and then charter schools. And you know, from at least from our perspective, you know, those are the areas like where I think there's the greatest need for students. I think there's maybe some questions about how you would define some of those weights and exactly what, you know, kind of groups would be included. But I would just say from our perspective, I think a lot of those feel right. And I do think, like, as an example, and I know, you know, Lauren and others probably would have some good thoughts on this, but, you know, thinking about what's to make sure, what we would want to make sure is included in unique learning needs, as an example. And one of the things that we're recommending is that actually there are separate weights, as an example, for English language learners and special education students. That would include, the special education would also include dyslexia and students who are gifted. So that's, anyway, we might want to spend a minute or two on that, just knowing that that kind of is out there over the last week in terms of the specific weights that are being put forward through the framework.
Okay, so we want to make sure what we have ties to the poverty and concentrated poverty. And it was recommended for heavy. So for us, do we also want to do the same thing? I think you mentioned, are we good with the list that we have, or do we want to add anything? Do we have rule on our list? Do we have the?
I think we had it under sparsity, which is probably how I would recommend defining
Okay.
it. But yeah, but I think that's how we had talked about it, Yolanda.
Okay.
And I don't mean to encourage us to have to change this list. I just wanted to mention that that's what was put out last week, so people kind of know what the 4 areas were that were sort of put forward in the framework last week.
So,
Okay.
so Yolanda, I'd like to, I cautiously raise this issue for discussion. We are well aware that quite specifically, African Americans underperform. African American males underperform.
Say it.
Dare we add
I agree.
African American males at a minimum as a
Well, and my concern is, my big concern, especially after reading that draft, is that there is an assumption that we're covering or like taking care of our Black students by naming, economically disadvantaged or poverty. And that is not the case when you look at the data across the state in terms of the achievement gap. The achievement gap with our Black students it's regardless of income.
Right.
And so we are seriously, and it's not being talked about. And I don't know, and I think I brought this up before, I don't know where it is. Is it in outcomes? Is it in weights? But we have to be very clear that this is a group that needs attention and support, because we want all students in Tennessee to be achieving their post-secondary successes, not just some. So I'm with you.
And I know, Russ, I know TBR has done a lot of research on that, and that has been proven over and over again. So I think we should include it, and we should be bold enough to include it.
Yeah, I think, and I'm harkening back, Lauren, to the discussion we had last time about, where the proper place is to include it. I'm much more comfortable with having it as an outcome than a weight. I think having an explicit sort of equity emphasis in that outcome is proper. I have an issue, I guess, philosophically with sort of identifying a student who needs a greater weight, just because of a demographic characteristic. Whereas if we attack that more on the back end and emphasize the necessity of that equity imperative in the outcomes, I think that's a much more appropriate place to put that emphasis.
Any comments? Lauren, what do you think about having it in the outcomes?
Yeah, this is hard. I mean, this is where I struggle philosophically. I want whatever is going to get the resources to these kids, especially our Black males, from kindergarten through 12th grade and on. So if you feel like having it in the outcomes is going to get the attention and the resources towards this population, then great. I don't want to miss an opportunity and like I said, this is not my, skill set. So if outcome seems where that's where, since it's an outcome, then school districts, LEAs will be held responsible for that outcome. But then what's the resource? What's going to be done for these kids? And so there's where I kind of get in the weeds.
Logan, what?
I agree with everyone.
Well, I will say an outcome. I mean, I definitely understand what Russ is saying, because you don't want to kind of make it look like we're saying something that we're not. But I want it to be powerful enough that it grabs the attention that it deserves. If that makes sense.
Yolanda, are we talking about resources and performance? Are we talking about maybe two different measures that we can place, or two different buckets that we can place in two different places here? And I'm not sure. I mean, we want to see increased outcomes, right?
Yes.
For this particular population, but we also know that as a result, we need increased resources directed intentionally to this population? Is there a way to split it out that puts it into two different places that gives us the emphasis we need or not? I'm not sure.
David, what do you think?
Yeah, this is a really important question because at the end of the day, right? I mean, we've talked about this before. This is a math problem, right? I mean, like at the end of the day, our students of color, and particularly our students of color who are economically disadvantaged, should be receiving more resources per student than they're receiving now. That's what we want to see. And so the question is, how do you get there in the way you sort of define the outcomes or the weights? My thought on this question would be that I think we capture a lot of what we've just talked about by including strong weights for things like economically disadvantaged students, for weights like concentrated poverty, for weights for students with unique learning needs, and even as an example for a charter weight, 90+% of students at charter schools are students of color. And so, I think my sense would be through the combination of those weights, we're going to we should result in a substantially more significant set of resources going to our highest need students and students of color. You think like on the outcomes piece, as an example, I think the same thing could be true. One piece of feedback that we would have is that we shouldn't be addressing sort of all outcomes funding the same. Any outcomes funding should be specifically focused on our highest need students, success with our highest need students. So, I think to Logan's point, at the end of the day, like our students of color should be receiving more resources than they're receiving now to help them to make sure that we're supporting a better learning experience for them. My sense would be that we do capture that through having very strong weights for some of the areas that we've just talked about.
Okay, so you think we should not literally say it, but make sure that the weights support it?
My only concern about that is what was mentioned before, which is not when you disaggregate out the economic factors, our Black students are still not achieving at the same level. And so we're going to miss a group if we only are highlighting economically disadvantaged and concentrated poverty and things like that. So I agree with what you're saying. I just don't want to miss that. Like we have to, if we're going to do this right, I feel like we need to capture them all and say it somehow. Right. And maybe they don't want to hear it, but I think we've got to, obviously if the committee agrees, but somehow we've got to start speaking up for the kids who are falling through the cracks because they don't hit any of these weighted groups, especially our Black males.
Russ?
Thinking about the framework that David provided, I generally am attracted to that. And let me be clear, and Yolanda, I think you were saying earlier, I kept hearing the word in my head, stigmatize. Like we don't want to stigmatize a student and say, because you're Black, therefore we presume that you need X. I think if we instead say, here's a student, regardless of his or her background demographic, if we see they are struggling performance-wise, if we see they're low income, if we see these other aspects that demonstrably then lead us to conclude that they are behind, that's where policy kicks in. I think stigmatizing a student to say, because you're Black, therefore, I think that's the wrong approach philosophically. And I say that not to say we ought to put in the outcomes, not the weights, to make it more politically palatable, though it may be. I think it's the right philosophical approach to say to our students, we're going to have resources kick in because we identify, for whatever reason, that you are struggling to perform where you need to. I think that philosophical approach is required regardless of a student's demographic background. To say that it starts and stops with their demographic background, I think is the wrong approach. And so I think capturing that idea in the way that David described, I think gets at the core issue and avoids the stigma, at least in my mind, of exclusively making a weight because of a demographic.
And I will add, Yolanda, here, that makes sense to me. Russell's argument makes sense to me. It's politically palatable, and I think it's sustainable over time. If the funding model works and African Americans males start to achieve, and then there's some other group that then becomes white. If it becomes white males, then that model works. Now, I do think we still do a disservice if we don't call out race to some extent somewhere in this document and be clear that African American males are underperforming or ethnically disadvantaged, however we describe it. I think we owe it to the citizens to say, here is a problem that we've got to face it to fix it.
Right. And I will say, of all the data with TBR, even from SCORE, everything that's been coming down, it's been saying that we have to do something about it. So I'm not sure how to word it, but I do think it should be included just so they will know that we are aware of it. And as a state, we should be responding to it more directly. I just don't have the words for it. I don't know how to say it properly. So, but I'll be thinking about that, and just due to time, we're just going to continue to move on and come back to this.
Hey, Yolanda.
Yes.
Let me share this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the accountability model, but districts are held accountable for subgroups, and one of those, all of those subgroups include there's a BHN, economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, and EL, and BHN is Black, Hispanic, and Native American. So there is an accountability measure in the model already that holds districts accountable for that, and it could be part of the accountability model where you include it in that outcome, as well as the weight. And I don't think there's anything wrong with you all. I've done this with other subcommittees. If you want to put it in both, just to make certain your voice is heard, that you feel strongly about it, it should be one of these places. So you put it both places. So I just wanted to put that out there about the accountability model.
How do y'all feel about that? Adding the accountability.
Yolanda, I'm not trying to take us on a tangent, but I do think what we're really trying to get at the root here is going back to this idea of being academically prepared. Regardless of background, every kid has a fair shot at being academically prepared for post-secondary, right? If that, that is what we're trying to accomplish, right? In my mind. And so is there an indicator of that academic third grade reading, 8th grade math, whatever this is, that we could say, once this indicator falls below a certain percentage point, that is the student that receives additional help? And I don't know enough about those indicators, quite frankly, to know what that is. But in my mind, we're trying to really grab hold of academically fragile students, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. And so help me, all of you that are smarter than me in that K-12 space, is there something that we could pinpoint and put a weight on that?
Do we use the phrase academically fragile anywhere?
I do all the time, but I don't think it's in here. It feels like the nice way to say it.
So with the RTI framework, there is schools across the state use the RTI framework for academics. And so if you wanted to get that specific, you can look at, tiers is basically how they organize it before a child is moved on to testing for special education. And so much happens when a child is, you know, based on test scores K through 12, when they're identified as tier 2, tier 3, determines what kind of additional support interventions they're getting. So if you want to go to that type of detail, and Penny, you can help me more. Like I'm pretty confident that all the school districts across the state implement RTI, but you know, I am only familiar with the schools I work in.
Yes, every school has RTI. Now we have Tennessee All Core, which also identifies students. Districts could choose to participate with that, and so there's remediation taking place that way now as well.
Okay. So again, probably what I will ask of the subcommittee today is that, you know, we do have 15 minutes left, but I think this is a topic that I would love to hear more on and just make sure that everyone's voice is heard. So I'm going to ask that, Kenny, do you think it will be okay for us again to ask for a little bit more time as far as if anyone wants to go out to this document? It's still a working document. We can take this form and put it in as a working document so we can make further changes. We'll keep moving on, and we're underweight, but I just want to make sure that I think this is a topic that I want to make sure we include it in a way that is pleasing to the subcommittee.
Yeah, and every week in our in your PowerPoint, every PowerPoint will have a follow-up section. That's the very first thing we do. So that's kind of like old business. So that's the first thing we do before we move on to the new business of the week. So we can I can pin this as our follow-up for next week, send the document back out, give the committee members an opportunity, because you all the draft is already out there. So at this point, they're wanting you to prioritize. And then this week, take a look at policies, talk about policies if you have time. But the main goal of the entire time together is to come up with that base outcome weight. So that's what we need to go back to and make sure that's done before we ever get to the policy. So we'll just do this as follow-up next week. Yolanda, you can send this back out once you and I bullet everything and get it prioritized, and then give the committee an opportunity to speak again on it and to comment. And I think that's exactly what you all should do. And we'll okay. That's the first thing we'll address next week in our follow-up.
Okay. So David, anything else anyone wants to comment on as far as weight?
I think the direct funding and performance are key portions for this group to talk about. So I'd suggest we move to the next section.
Okay. Direct funding.
Yeah, just for situational awareness on this one. So in the framework that was released last week, there were 3 categories for additional direct funding dollars. One was tutoring, one was college, career, and technical education, and the other was fast growing districts, which I know we've talked about as well. And I mean, obviously 2 of those 3 are directly aligned to the kind of, you know, expertise and priority areas of this subcommittee. And what I would just say from my perspective is I was really encouraged to see tutoring and college and career and technical education as direct funding categories. And I just would say from our feedback's perspective, maybe there's a way to just reinforce that those feel like really important areas to have direct funding resources for. And I think the CCTE stuff captures a lot of the areas that we have right here. I think those would all fit under that category. A lot of those would fit under that category. So, you know, pleased to see those 2 in particular. And then, so anyway, other folks may have thoughts, but just thought I'd mention those 2 in particular.
Well, I definitely agree with the CCTE, college, career, and technical education being funded directly. We mentioned tutoring before. So we can definitely add that as well. Any thoughts on fast growing? Because that was also recommended. Do we want to add it to our direct funding as well?
I was glad to see that included in this portion and not in the weights. So that I think is an improvement that I know this group had talked about. It's probably still not an area that I would recommend, but obviously if the group feels differently, we could certainly include it.
Yolanda, are you referring to fast growing communities?
Yeah, well, it says fast growing, significant enrollment growth within a school community warrants same year support for services provided as a result.
I will say that I also facilitate the suburban, municipal, and fast growing communities subgroup. Dr. Ted Horrell is the chair of that committee, and they also are focusing on those fast growing communities. So that's just something for you to think about.
Okay, so you're going to add those for our direct funding as well that we just mentioned?
Yes.
Where did, oh, sorry.
Where
did we come up with the 4th grade time frame for tutoring? Does anybody know where, like, how that was determined? 4th grade was determined as the time?
I'm not sure. In my comment was reacting
remember.
to it. Yeah, I don't know either.
Just only because there's from my own, working in the schools that I've worked in elementary for 16 years. The jump between 3rd and 4th grade is huge. Tradition, like even, high achieving students struggle with the jump. So if you are, I'm trying to think if you're it's front loading, like if you're making sure that by 3rd grade students are, have this bar for math skills, this bar for reading and writing skills, they're going into 4th grade more prepared. And so it's more of are we going to tutor because they're already behind and we missed an opportunity earlier? Or are we and I mean, it's splitting hairs truly, because 3rd and 4th grade, but with any intervention earlier typically is, and then you're looking maybe at, 6th grade, because you're trying to capture students who might have gotten into middle school and they're struggling. So even just naming like one grade level for tutoring or, high dosage tutoring seems, I don't know, it just doesn't compute. If that makes, like, I'm just wondering if that's enough.
That comment may have come from someone who's not on the call today, and they may have a better explanation. But
Hey,
I don't remember discussing it at all. So I'm wondering if it was just put in, by an edit in the document. So to Benny's point, whoever put it in there may not be here.
Well, I will say under tutoring, it has funding to provide high dosage, low ratio tutoring via Tennessee All Corps for rising 4th grade students who scored at below on the 3rd grade TCAP.
And that's the first time they take TCAPs, so that's how they're doing it. Okay,
yeah,
that's fine. I'm totally fine with that. I just know 3rd grade is just a big year, and they're so young.
Right. I think that's where it came from. So, as outlined in the learning loss and student acceleration statute. So,
actually, TCAP begins in 3rd grade instead of 4th grade. So I'm confused about the 4th grade as well. But that high dosage, low ratio tutoring would probably cover everything. And that Tennessee All Corps is just an example.
Yeah, it seems the key is to have the intervention occur somewhere in elementary school, and whether we 3rd, 4th, I mean, that's the key, right? Because these are the headwaters of all the downstream effects that we've been lamenting throughout our past meetings, right? Of college readiness, et cetera. This is where we attack the problem before it becomes metastasized, such where we can't deal with it when they're older.
And I think All Corps ranges from K-12. So there's high dosage, low ratio tutoring for K-12. Would you all like for me to add that?
Yes.
I mean, Is it not though worth us pointing out the necessity of doing that when they are in those middle or those third and fourth grade years? Isn't that really where that stone starts to roll down the hill in the way we don't want it? I mean, should we not emphasize that's really where it ought to be, have a primary focus?
It can be, because if you want to think of it this way, like third grade is still, we're teaching basic skills, we're acquiring skills, where fourth grade, we really start getting into application. So if they don't have the skills in third grade and we start tutoring, I mean, it says rising fourth graders, so I guess it's happening over the summer is my assumption. I don't know when this tutoring is occurring, but I would think it would be better if it happened before they entered their fourth grade year, because they're going to hit the ground running with application. And so that's kind of where I am. That's why and I don't want to get hung up on this, because all tutoring is great. But I do want us to think about, like, third grade is really where the skills need to be embedded.
Is this all right, Lauren? Is this what you think it should be?
I think that's great. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. For any other additions to direct funding?
Just one quick question. I know that last time we met, we talked a lot about differentiating between school counselors and career counseling. Didn't we talk about that in the direct funding piece, that career counseling should be a part of that? Or is it somewhere else in the document?
I thought we mentioned that in the base.
In the base.
In the base. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, are we ready? We have a few minutes left for outcomes.
Yeah, so I mean, two quick thoughts I'd have on the outcomes. One is, and maybe this is back to kind of Logan's point earlier, we would argue that any performance funding should be directly connected to better supporting the growth of economically disadvantaged students. And I think if you're funding just overall performance funding, you run the risk of actually providing more funding for students who are already, sort of far ahead. And so I think that would be the one thing I would note, is just making sure that any performance funding or outcomes funding is connected to growth with our highest need students. And then the second thing, even in the, I think, draft framework that was released last week, there are lots of different potential categories related to performance funding. Tennessee already has an indicator that measures whether students are college and career ready, this Ready Graduate indicator. And our recommendation would just be to tie any performance funding to the Ready Graduate indicator, which is a data point that we already have and that already captures, a lot of the measures that we've talked about, that other partners have talked about as well. So those would be two things that would be top of mind for me. But this is a really important category, I think, specifically for our subcommittee, because I think states that have done a performance funding component have typically connected that performance funding to something related to college and career readiness. So as a kind of bonus on top of the funding.
Well, when I look at the Ready Grad indicators with outcomes, it looks, I see ACT, SAT, data source. So where could we include what we discussed earlier, if this is where we want to put it? What would be your suggestions, David, to make sure we hit that area?
Yeah, I mean, I would include it not in terms of the specific measures, but I would include it as that those measures should be awarded bonus funding based on growth for our highest need students.
Okay. Any other comments for outcomes or performance funding?
I don't think what I wrote in there fits in this now that I'm looking at it more, because what I was trying to address is if we're actually going to be, spending more money in the base on certain support personnel, that it would be important to also then require accountability. But I think that probably fits in, every year school counselors are evaluated just, the same as teachers and administrators. So it may just fit in our accountability model. So we can take that part out. I think I wanted just to make sure that it's like, if we're going to put this investment in, we need to hold those, those professionals accountable for the work that they're doing, including, becoming certified in career counseling or something like that.
So you want to take the accountability out that you have under performance, under accountability,
Yeah.
take out that statement? Okay.
Yeah, just take it out. It doesn't fit.
So everything that's blue, Penny, she wants
Okay.
that out.
All right.
Any other should have, nice to have, or long shots? Any other comments? Well, we did it once again. It's 9:59. Y'all are professionals at this. So what I will do is we will get this document put into a bullet form. We will make it available in Teams once again. So for anyone that wants to give any additional reflection, feedback, comments before we actually forward this final document on, you will have that opportunity. So at this time,
Yolanda?
Yes.
Yeah, Yolanda, real quick. And I don't know why, but I requested access to the document 3 times and I never was able to get to it. So, so when we try it again, and when you put in the request, it says request access. I don't know who that went to, but I never got access to the document.
Okay. Go right ahead.
I don't know. Yolanda, it might be, we could try, I think Yolanda sent that out the last time. I can send that out this time and see if it makes a difference. I don't know that, but since I'm creating it, it could make a difference.
Well, this time I'll go to you if I can't get it, but yeah, it has that automated, you must request access, and I did that 3 times and never got to it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we want everyone to have access. So Penny, if you can just use
I will.
This Teams meeting to download this document, everyone already has access to it. So just add this file to this actual meeting and it should work.
To the chat.
I think Chrissy did it. So Chrissy slid in a block,
I will say, let me go back out before we leave about the public comment because I was thrown a little bit there because I downloaded all the documents I received. So I asked T&EDU, and here's the answer. There it is. Public comment is in the Google folders. Oh, that's the main Google folder instead of the week 5. It's in that main Google folder. And so you're probably going to see me sending another note to you because they've asked that we send this out to each subcommittee. An additional batch of public comment and an updated tracker is now loaded into your Google folders and ready for review. We will deliver a final batch after the deadline for public comment, which was yesterday, January the 18th at noon. So there should be an extra batch in there. And I know that someone else said that there are over 900 comments. And this comment said, if you would start around PDF 820, that's after the draft was released, PDF 820, you should be able to see public comments specifically on the draft, but it's in that main Google folder instead of week 5. Okay, that's all I have, Yolanda.
Okay. So everyone, you'll have access to this document. When would we like to have a deadline? When do you have to submit this, Penny?
They usually like that. They'll probably be asking me where it is. Probably, yes, say this by Friday afternoon.
Okay. So what about tomorrow? Can everyone just log in? Tomorrow's good. And to give Penny time to do what she needs to do with the document. And again, I believe our next and final meeting will be on, what's the date? I know it's in the slide presentation somewhere.
January 26th.
The 26th, and we'll be talking about policy. I will be sending a link to you about a video that discusses policy in a little bit more depth that might help us in our conversation for those that are not policy experts. So I'll send that out today as well. So everyone have a fantastic rest of your day. I'll see everyone on the 26th. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.